The day Thomas was supposed to arrive began with an odd sense of unease. Josh, as always, was rushing off to work, preparing for his business trip. His suitcase stood by the door while I stared absently at the kitchen, trying to decide what to cook for dinner. "Thomas probably hasn't changed," Josh muttered, adjusting his tie. "But if he starts talking too much about his business, just nod and smile." I smirked, masking my unease. Thomas was my adoptive father, but our relationship had always been formal. After his wife passed, we rarely saw each other, and I couldn't say I missed him. When the car pulled up to the house, I noticed Thomas looked different. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his posture exuded confidence. He entered with a calm smile, carrying the scent of expensive cologne and an air of assuredness. "Emily, you look wonderful," he said, lightly touching my hand. That evening, we sat down for dinner. I chose a fitted dress, wanting to present myself well, though I wasn't sure why. Thomas watched me more intently than I liked, his jokes making me feel self-conscious. "That dress, it really accentuates your figure," he said with a subtle smile. Josh wouldn't have noticed something like that, I thought bitterly. His compliments had become a rarity. After dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. His confidence, his demeanor, his gaze, it all unexpectedly lingered in my mind. I felt an odd sense of excitement, unable to understand why. The next day after Thomas arrived, he offered to help me in the garden. Gardening had always been my way to unwind, to relax, but with Thomas around, that sense of calm seemed distant. He took his time watching me trim the bushes, making light jokes that sometimes felt a bit too personal to be comfortable. "I remember how you always wanted to do everything yourself," he said, bending down to pick up the pruning shears I had accidentally dropped. "Strong and independent, but sometimes help can be useful." I smiled, trying to hide my unease. His words reminded me that Josh often dismissed my efforts, assuming I should handle everything on my own. Thomas, on the other hand, offered his help without diminishing my worth. We continued working, and soon Thomas began sharing stories from his past. He talked about building his career, how important honesty was in relationships with partners and friends. His stories sounded like he wanted to show that my husband, Josh, was far from those ideals. "You know, Emily, I've always valued people who can be real." "Honesty is a rare thing," he said, looking up at me. His eyes were warm, but there was something more there, something that made me feel vulnerable. During a break, we sat on the bench by the flower bed. Thomas handed me a bottle of water, and our hands brushed against each other. It was a fleeting moment, but I felt my heart skip a beat. I tried to brush off the feeling, focusing on the conversation, but the excitement lingered. Thomas looked at me for too long, his gaze penetrating, as if he wanted to say something but hesitated. Finally, he spoke. "Sometimes it's more important to be understood than just loved." Those words hung in the quiet of the garden, and I couldn't find a response. They stayed with me, as if they had opened a door to something I had long been afraid to think about. That night, I couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts were swirling in my head, none of them giving me peace. Eventually, I decided to go down to the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea. When I walked into the kitchen, the light was on, and I saw Thomas sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, looking up at me. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, and in the darkness of the night, it created a sense of intimacy between us. I nodded and sat down across from him. We started talking, nothing specific, just general things about life. Thomas spoke about how lonely he had felt after his wife's death, and for the first time I saw not just a confident man, but a person who needed support. "Family isn't always about blood ties," he said, and there was something deeply personal in his words. "Sometimes those who truly understand you become closer than family." His words touched me. I felt a warmth spreading through my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas felt something more for me. Then there was a pause, and silence hung between us. Thomas looked at me, his gaze penetrating and full of emotion. And before I could fully understand, he suddenly leaned in and kissed me. I pulled away, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe what had just happened. My eyes scanned his face, which reflected regret, and at the same time something incredibly warm and sincere. "I'm sorry," he whispered. But I was already up and leaving the kitchen without saying a word. Inside, a storm of emotions raged. Guilt, fear, and something I couldn't name, but it was too strong to ignore. In the following days, I tried my best to avoid Thomas. I thought that if I could keep my distance from him, I might be able to forget what had happened. But every time I walked past him, I could feel his gaze, and it made me uneasy. He acted as if nothing had happened. Thomas didn't try to talk about the kiss or make any hints, but his presence had become a source of tension for me. He was still attentive to me, his jokes were light, but now I felt an underlying subtext in them. Sometimes he would inadvertently touch my hand or shoulder, and each time it made me freeze. I felt a struggle inside me. Part of me wanted to walk away, while another part wanted to stay, to delve into this strange, unsettling attraction that had formed between us. One of those days when I could no longer hold back my emotions, I decided to talk to Sarah. She was my best friend, and I hoped her advice would help me make sense of things. We met at a cafe, and I told her about my doubts and worries. I didn't mention that it was about Thomas, saying only that there was someone in my life who made me feel differently. "You've been so thoughtful lately," Sarah noted, looking at me with slight concern. "Are you sure everything is okay?" I nodded, but I knew it was far from okay. I wanted to tell her everything, but fear and guilt held me back. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it would make the situation real, irreversible. That evening, when I returned home, I saw Thomas again. He was sitting in the living room reading a newspaper, and when he saw me, he smiled as if nothing had happened. I felt my heart skip a beat. Despite the guilt, I found myself waiting for the next encounter with him. It was foolish, dangerous, but I couldn't rid myself of that desire. The party organized by Josh's friends promised to be casual and relaxed. Josh was in his element, laughing and socializing while I tried to keep up, even though I felt uncomfortable. Everything changed when Thomas appeared in the doorway. I hadn't expected to see him, and his presence suddenly made the evening tense. He approached me with a smile that might have seemed innocent to an outsider, but I knew there was more behind it. We exchanged brief greetings, and I felt my heart beating faster. His presence was too obvious to me, even though no one else seemed to notice. Throughout the evening, Thomas subtly flirted with me. It was unnoticeable to others, but every glance, every light touch carried a hidden meaning. Our eyes met, and I felt the tension between us grow stronger with every passing moment. At some point, when a slow song started playing, Thomas came up to me and, extending his hand, asked me to dance. I hesitated, but eventually took his hand. We danced, keeping a distance between us, but every movement felt filled with hidden meaning. His hand rested on my waist, and I felt the tension between us grow with each step. We didn't say a word, but our eyes said much more than words ever could. After the party, as guests began to leave, Thomas approached me. His gaze was serious, and I saw determination in his eyes. "Emily, I can't hide this any longer," he said quietly. "What's happening between us, I can't ignore it. But the choice is yours." I remained silent, feeling a storm of emotions inside me. Thomas's words made me realize that these feelings had become too strong to ignore. I knew I was on the verge of making a decision that would change everything, but fear and a sense of duty to Josh held me back. When I was tidying up the living room, I stumbled upon a small note lying on the edge of the table. The paper was folded in half, and something about it made me pause. I unfolded it and my heart skipped a beat. The handwriting belonged to Thomas. "Emily, I can't pretend anymore. What's happening between us isn't just a fleeting infatuation. I know it's wrong, but my feelings for you are too strong to ignore." I read those words several times, and each one seemed to pierce through me. Thomas had written what I was afraid to admit to myself. Our connection had gone too deep. I felt that it wasn't just attraction. It was something much more profound. But with that realization came fear and guilt. What was I doing? How had I let it get this far? Later that day, I decided to talk to Thomas. I found him in the garden, trimming the bushes. When he saw me, something flickered in his eyes, a mix of anxiety and hope. "We need to talk," I began, and he seemed to understand immediately what it was about. We sat down on the bench and I showed him the note. Thomas sighed, his gaze becoming heavy. "Emily, I don't want to ruin your life," he said, his voice quiet but full of determination. "But I can't ignore what I feel any longer. It's stronger than me." His words made me freeze. I looked at him, and suddenly all my fears and doubts began to dissolve. For the first time, I admitted to myself that I felt much more for Thomas than I should. It wasn't just attraction, not just a crush. It was a real feeling, and I could no longer deny it. But at the same time, I knew I had to do something to stop it. I couldn't allow myself to destroy my family. I made the decision to distance myself from Thomas, to stay as far away from him as possible. But when I looked into his eyes, I realized it was already too late. We had gone too far, and there was no turning back. I decided that a hot bath would help me relax. Filling the jacuzzi, I sank into the warm water, closing my eyes and trying to push all thoughts of Thomas away. It seemed that only here in this quiet space could I briefly forget my doubts and feelings. But I had left the bathroom door slightly open, forgetting about everything. The water enveloped my body, and I sank into my thoughts, trying to find answers to the questions that tormented me. What to do about Thomas? How to deal with my feelings? But there were no answers. Suddenly, I heard someone enter. I startled and opened my eyes, seeing Thomas. He froze, realizing I was there. His face showed confusion. "Sorry, I didn't know you were here," he said, but he didn't move. I tried to cover myself, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. His gaze lingered on me, and I saw something in his eyes that couldn't be ignored. Desire, emotions he was no longer trying to hide. He stepped closer, and a tense silence hung between us. I couldn't look away, and at some point a spark ignited between us. Thomas leaned down, and I felt his breath on my skin. My heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed impossible not to hear it. His lips touched mine, and everything else ceased to exist. In that moment, I realized we had crossed all possible boundaries. It was irreversible, and I knew I couldn't pull back. Our bodies came together, and I felt every touch, every emotion tearing me apart from the inside. When it was over, Thomas stood up without saying a word. He dried himself with a towel and, giving me one last look, left the bathroom. I was left alone, my heart still pounding. Everything that had happened was wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had waited my entire life for this moment. In the past few days, I had been receiving notes from Thomas, which he left on my desk, in books, even in the pocket of my coat. In these notes, he confessed his feelings for me, and with each new message, I became more and more nervous. His words were full of sincerity and desire, and I understood that the fire growing between us couldn't be easily extinguished. But along with it came guilt, which grew with each passing day. Josh began to notice that something was wrong. He tried to be attentive, asked if everything was okay, but I just smiled and said I was tired. His care should have brought me relief, but instead I felt like I was deceiving him, and that made everything worse. Day by day, my distraction became more evident, and I could see that Josh was beginning to suspect something was off. One evening, when Josh came home from work, he looked at me closely and then asked, "Emily, are you sure everything is okay with us? You've been so distant lately." I tried to pretend that everything was fine. I smiled and walked over to him, wrapping my arms around his neck. "Of course, everything's fine. Just a lot going on," I said, hoping he would believe me. But I saw doubt in his eyes. My inner conflicts were becoming too apparent. I tried to ignore Thomas's notes, tried to convince myself that it was all wrong, that I had to stop. But it was all in vain. Every time I read his words, I found myself waiting for the next encounter with him. I knew it was dangerous, that it could destroy my life. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The desire to see Thomas again was too strong, and there was nothing I could do about it anymore. The evening started with a quiet tension that had been hanging in the air for days. Josh was sitting in the living room, silently flipping through the pages of a newspaper while I cooked dinner in the kitchen. I could feel his gaze, even though he pretended to be absorbed in reading. The atmosphere was tense, and I knew the conversation I dreaded was imminent. When I placed the plates on the table, Josh suddenly put the newspaper aside and stood up. His eyes were full of suspicion, and I realized that the conversation was about to happen. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his voice cold as steel. "I can't do this anymore. You're clearly hiding something from me." I froze, unsure of what to say. My heart sank and I knew I couldn't find any excuses. He continued, not giving me a chance to say anything. "I suspect you're seeing someone," Josh said, his voice trembling with anger. "Is it one of your colleagues? Are you meeting someone from work?" His words were like a blow. I wanted to deny it, to say it wasn't true, but the truth was too terrifying to speak. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I stood there, unable to say anything. At that moment, Thomas entered the living room. He saw what was happening and, instantly understanding the situation, stepped between us. "Josh, you're wrong," Thomas said firmly, looking him in the eye. "Emily doesn't deserve your accusations. She hasn't done anything wrong." His intervention only intensified Josh's suspicions. He stared at Thomas, then looked back at me, and I could see only distrust in his eyes. "So it's you, Thomas?" he asked bitterly. "You're defending her like you know something I don't." I couldn't bear the tension any longer. Tears rolled down my cheeks and I felt on the verge of breaking. Thomas turned to me and I saw regret and pain in his eyes. "Emily," he said quietly, "maybe I should leave. It's the best solution to keep from ruining your family." His words pierced through me. I knew it was the right thing to do, but part of me didn't want him to leave. Thomas was offering to leave for my sake, to save my family. I took a deep breath, trying to get my emotions under control, and said, "No, Thomas, please stay. I don't want everything to fall apart. We'll find a way to deal with this." Josh watched us in silence, and I saw the hurt and anger in his eyes. I knew a difficult road lay ahead of us, but the decision had already been made. Thomas stayed, and I hoped we could find a way to deal with the mess we had created. After the tense events of the past few weeks, I decided that I had to try to rebuild my relationship with Josh. I wanted to forget about Thomas, to leave it all behind. I tried to spend more time with Josh, cooked his favorite meals, tried to be more attentive and caring. But despite all my efforts, our closeness felt formal. It was as if we were following some long-forgotten scripts, trying to recreate something that had already been lost. Every time Josh touched me, I felt that he was trying to figure out where we had lost each other. But all I could feel was emptiness. His embraces no longer brought me the sense of security they once had. I tried to be tender, but my words and touches felt artificial to me. Everything started to feel like acting, and I knew Josh could sense it too. Despite all my attempts to forget, Thomas stayed in my thoughts. His notes and small gifts, which I found here and there, reminded me of what had happened between us. They were like fragments of that passion I could no longer deny. Sometimes, when I was alone, I would take out one of his notes and read it again, feeling something come alive inside me. Thomas was a part of me, and I didn't know how to let go of him. Josh noticed my distance. He asked questions, trying to understand what was happening to me. His concern grew with each passing day, and I could see suspicion in his eyes. He couldn't understand why I was still so distracted, why our relationship wasn't returning to normal. His questions made me feel even worse, as I knew I couldn't give him the truth, which could destroy everything. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Josh looked at me for a long time and asked, "Emily, you're hiding something, aren't you? I can't shake the feeling that we're drifting apart." I tried to smile, but it was a weak attempt. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I realized I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I took a deep breath and shook my head. "It's not that simple, Josh," I replied, feeling the contradictions tearing me apart inside. In that moment, I realized that my life would never be the same again. Thomas had left a mark on my soul that I couldn't simply erase. My heart was torn between duty and desire, and I knew that no matter how hard I tried, there was no way to put everything back in place. The morning started with a cold rain pounding on the window, and with an overwhelming feeling of emptiness inside. I continued living as if nothing had happened, but every minute without Thomas felt like a lie. I tried to focus on my usual chores, but this morning, while putting things away in the closet, I stumbled upon a small package neatly wrapped in paper. My heart skipped a beat, and I carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a portrait of me drawn with soft, almost ethereal lines. On the back was a note. I read it, and its words pierced me to the core. "You will always be my truth." Tears flowed down my cheeks involuntarily. Thomas couldn't forget me, just as I couldn't forget him. This portrait was a reminder that there was something real between us, something that couldn't just disappear. I held it in my hands, feeling a burning pain and longing inside me. I couldn't erase Thomas from my life, no matter how hard I tried. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the portrait, and realized that my feelings for Thomas were a part of me. I couldn't just deny or ignore them. But what was I supposed to do with this knowledge? How could I keep living, knowing that part of me belonged to another man? It was a question I had no answer to. Later, when Josh came home, I tried to act as normal as possible. I hid the portrait away so he wouldn't see it, but his gaze was suspicious. He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to read my thoughts. "Is everything okay, Emily?" he asked, his voice gentle but with a hint of concern. "Of course, everything's fine," I replied, trying to smile. But deep down, I knew he suspected something. My life had changed, and I could no longer go back to what it used to be. Thomas had left his mark, and that mark was too deep to simply erase. I stood by the window watching the twilight fall outside our house, thinking about how much my life had changed. The past few weeks had been filled with difficult decisions and emotions I couldn't just shake off. It felt like I was living in two parallel realities. One with Josh, where I tried to restore the familiar order, and the other with Thomas, which existed only in my thoughts and memories. And there, in the distance across the street, I saw a silhouette I couldn't mistake. Thomas. He stood there as if waiting for something, and although the distance between us was great, I felt something strong and irresistible ignite in my chest again. Our eyes met for a moment, and I knew he understood everything without words. Tears began to well up, but I tried to hold them back. Thomas was a part of me, and nothing could change that. When Thomas walked away, I sank into a chair, trying to deal with the emotions washing over me, and took out his notes. I read them again, every line, every word. His words were full of sincerity. His feelings were real, and I knew our connection was unbreakable. Thomas had left a mark that couldn't be erased. No matter how much I wanted to go back to my old life, I was left alone in the silence, realizing that my choice had already been made. Whatever it was, I couldn't change what had happened. I was torn between duty and my feelings, and I knew it had changed me forever. There were many questions in my mind without answers, but one thing I knew for sure. Everything that had happened had left a deep mark, and our story was not yet over. I looked out the window once more as if hoping to see Thomas again, but the street was empty. Would we have a future? Would I ever be able to make a choice that would bring me true happiness? I didn't know, but I knew that our paths would cross again, and something about that promise left me in suspense and anticipation. A few days later, as the rain and the grayness of November surrounded us, I knew it was finally time to face Josh honestly. Thomas was gone, leaving only memories and pain. But now I needed to regain the trust we had lost. And even though my feelings were divided, I knew that my duty and my family deserved an attempt to rebuild what we once had. That evening, when Josh returned from work, I decided to prepare dinner for just the two of us. I cooked his favorite dish, set candles on the table, and played soft, gentle music. Everything had to be perfect, to bring back even a piece of our closeness. I saw Josh's surprise when he entered the house and saw the atmosphere I had created. He smiled, but there was still doubt in his eyes. "Emily, what is all this?" he asked, approaching me and gently wrapping his arms around my shoulders. I felt his warmth, and something inside me shifted. I looked into his eyes and said, "It means I want to try again. I want to get back what we lost. I'm sorry for everything." Josh was silent for a moment, his gaze softening. He slowly raised his hand and ran his fingers along my cheek, then pulled me closer and kissed me. It was a soft, warm kiss that reminded me of the times when we were happy. I felt my heart respond, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that there was still something real between us. We slowly sat down at the table, talking about our day. I tried to be honest, not hiding my emotions, and I saw Josh beginning to open up to me. His eyes were no longer full of suspicion. Instead, I saw in them a desire to regain what we had lost. Later, when we cleared the dishes and went to the bedroom, Josh approached me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and looked into my eyes. In his gaze, I saw a passion he hadn't shown in a long time. "I know it's been hard, Emily," he said, his voice low and slightly hoarse. "But I believe we can fix this. I believe in us." He kissed me, but this time the kiss was deep and passionate. I felt all my doubts begin to dissolve. We melted into the moment, forgetting everything else that had been happening around us. Josh was there, and I felt his hands holding me, his touch reviving what had seemed long lost. That night was full of passion and feelings I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was just the two of us, and everything else lost its significance. I realized that this reunion was our attempt to restore trust and intimacy, and I hoped it would be the beginning of something new for both of us. As we lay together afterward, I looked at him and felt gratitude. Josh had believed in me, despite all the doubts and suspicions, and I knew that now it all depended on us. Thomas had left his mark, but in that moment, I wanted only one thing: to be with Josh and to rebuild what we had lost. It had been a few weeks since Josh and I decided to rebuild our relationship. We spent more time together trying to regain the lost moments of closeness. Josh made an effort, and I reciprocated. It seemed like our bond was growing stronger, and the feelings that had once cooled were starting to reignite. One evening, we decided to relax in the jacuzzi. I prepared the bath, filling it with hot water and adding aromatic bubbles. Josh and I got into the jacuzzi, laughing and enjoying the moment. It felt so good to feel his closeness again, his hands on my skin. The water was soothing, and his touch rekindled the passion I had been longing for. Suddenly, in the midst of our moment, my phone, which was lying on the edge of the tub, vibrated. I saw Thomas's name on the screen. My heart skipped a beat. I felt an instant sense of guilt, but also determination. I could no longer allow him to be a part of my life. In that moment, holding Josh in my arms, I knew I had to make a choice. I read Thomas's message. He wrote that he missed me and couldn't forget me. His words were filled with longing and love, and for a moment I felt a pang of weakness. But then I looked at Josh, at his eyes full of trust and at his smile so genuine. I knew I couldn't betray him again. With courage and determination, I lifted my phone and took a picture of Josh and me, close together, embracing, surrounded by bubbles. In the photo, we looked happy, free from the past. I sent it to Thomas along with a short message: "This is my choice. Please understand and let me go." Josh noticed that I had sent a message and his gaze turned cautious. "Is everything okay?" he asked, trying to catch my eyes. I smiled and leaned in to kiss him, as if to show that there were no more secrets between us. "Yes, everything's fine," I replied, feeling the weight that had hung over me for so long finally lift. "Everything's really fine now." My phone vibrated a few more times, but I didn't check the messages. Thomas needed to understand that our story was over. I had chosen my family, my home, and now all that remained was to hold on to that choice and never look back. Josh held me tightly, and I felt the water wash away all the tension, all the doubts. In that moment, I was with the one I loved, and I felt that I had finally made the right choice.